Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Dave Cohen. I am a director at Myna Partners, and I want to start off by thanking you all for joining us today. We've got quite a great program put together for you. I think you're going to find it very and, informative and hopefully really useful for what you're doing in your offices and get some great takeaways. So let me now cover the agenda for the program that we've got in store for you here. Just want to give you a little bit of structure to the conversation. We are going to start off in just a minute. I'm going to introduce you to our other two panelists, and you'll get to know a little bit about them and their backgrounds. And then we're going to move into why we're here to talk about this topic, why this remains a very salient and relevant topic today, and an important one for those of you who are working on compliance programs. And then we're going to take a look at what does a cookie compliance program look like now? What does cookie compliance actually look like in terms of, program and the tools and technologies that you want to be using and what you want to be attending to? And then we're going to take a deeper dive into that in terms of what it looks like inside a real cookie compliance, a cookie consent audit. So what does it look like when you use the tools, and what are you uncovering, and what are your next steps following that? Then we're going to take a quick look at the regulatory landscape. What's been happening recently in terms of enforcement actions. What is it? What are the regulators looking for? What are their expectations? What are their standards? And then we're going to leave you with some really solid practical takeaways that you can go back and implement tomorrow. Our take on how you should be approaching this compliance challenge, and with very clear steps about what you should be doing in your program. And hopefully we'll be able to provide you with a little information about where you can close some gaps or even stand up a brand new program if that's where you're at. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We'll move to the next slide here. And I'd like to introduce my panelists. Jimmy Durante is a Senior Solutions Engineer with me over here at Myna. Jimmy, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about your role here currently, and also a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. My name is Jimmy Durante. As Dave said, I've been in data privacy for a little bit over 3 years now. I've also been a part of Myna for a little bit over 3 years now. So, as you can see, I'm a senior solutions engineer over here at Myna. I kind of specialize in all compliance aspects over here, where it's cookie consent, universal consent, preference and consent management. Today, I'll kind of be discussing actually the inside of real cookie audit, how we do it over here at Myna, and also how Privado helps us out do that. And it's pretty cool all around. But I'll pass things over to V.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks, Dave. Hey, everyone. Excited to be part of the webinar today. My name is V. I'm the founder and CEO of Privado AI. My background actually starts with in product management, specifically working with digital teams on websites and mobile apps. And essentially, like this is back in 2018, got the opportunity to work on a cookie compliance project even back then. And that's for GDPR, and it was all about finding the cookies.
Mm-hmm.
And 2026, of course, now the conversation is, which is kind of the entire webinar, it's not about just finding, you know, putting the cookie banner, adding the notice, but actually testing. So Privado, of course, we have technology, including website auditing tools, mobile app auditing tools that mimic user journeys similar to a regulator or a litigator, and help privacy teams find issues, fix issues, and report it upwards. We work with minor partners once we have all these issues as well. Like they actually operate the tool, help the teams address those issues. So yeah, it's a pretty exciting webinar because we've seen the problem from both sides
Mm-hmm.
of the house, practitioner, technology partners. So yeah, pretty excited to chat about things. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, V, and thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, so it really is a terrific partnership. Over at Myna, where Jimmy is hands-on keyboards at a number of different client sites and helping solve these problems in real time, in real situations, use cases. And then we, of course, lean heavily on the tool that Privado has been able to create. It's an amazing tool, and we'll talk about some of the details in just a little bit. So moving on, we are now want to kind of let you know what the current state of play is out there in terms of compliance risk this year in 2026. So I've been in this privacy space for about 18 years now. It's incredible. So I've seen a lot, as V mentioned a while ago, the big drop of GDPR and even previous to that. And there was a time, not even that long ago, when regulators used to kind of go and look at a website, and if they had a relatively recent privacy notice, that's the public facing notice making privacy promises to customers and consumers on a website, and there was a banner that was being raised and looked like you had some preferences, and it looked like things were basically in order from a quick glance at the website, that they were going to move on to look for more egregious actors where there's no privacy policy in place at all, no consent mechanisms whatsoever. But that is no longer the case. That is not what's happening today in 2026. Today, the regulatory agencies have become much more sophisticated technically. They have sometimes big teams of legal and technical experts. They use tools like Privado and others to actually go in and not only notice whether there's a notice and a banner being displayed and some preference options for consent being offered, but they not only need to be offered, they need to actually work. So it's not that difficult to simulate a user coming in from whatever jurisdiction you want, and to go through opting in, opting out, selecting preferences, and then seeing if those preferences are actually honored downstream. So that is where the compliance risk has gotten much higher if your systems don't actually work, and if you are not able to operationalize the promises that you're making in your privacy notice. So that's kind of the state of play now. It's much more complicated, and as you can see on the left hand side here, some of the almost any large company or even medium-sized companies have a relatively complex vendor ecosystem, and those third parties create risk for you if you're acting as the using GDPR language of the controller in the controller processor relationship. Something you need to look at. And another thing that I want to just quickly point out before we move on is that dark patterns. For those of you that aren't familiar with the term dark patterns, it's really, I find it fascinating. In terms of your UI, your website design, you need to have choices for consumers be offered equally. So, for instance, an opt-in and an opt-out button should be the same color, the same font size, put in relatively, next to each other, as opposed to having a great big huge green opt-in button and then a small plain text opt-out in the bottom right-hand corner of the page. If you are steering people graphically toward one decision over another, and can be a subjective call, you can be in violation of having dark patterns in place, and that can be a real problem. So,
Yeah, and
that'd be.
Dave, yeah, all great points. And just doubling down on what you were saying on the regulatory piece, I do want to add the recent announcement by Cal Privacy around the audit division. I added it on the comments. The take itself from the blog post is pretty interesting because the way the auditor and the audit division talks about their role is more like a compliance inspector,
Mhm.
and they drive the analogy of a health inspector, and they don't wait for you to reach a hospital before checking a restaurant kitchen, and they're trying to be proactive and in auditing the program. And I think if I look at auditing a privacy program, the thing that first thing is visible and is super auditable is your website, kind of like front of office and back office. Or if we take the restaurant analogy, if i'm if I'm seeing like the front of the restaurant, which is where people sit, is not clean, I mean, I'm pretty sure the health inspector is going to look at your back office really, really, the kitchen really, in a much more detailed way. So I think, yeah, from a risk mitigation perspective, also tying things around, having a website which is compliant helps a lot, because we all know, like, it's a struggle to get the data maps done, the assessments done, but the scrutiny also increases if your websites are not compliant because they're so visible.
Yeah, absolutely, V. And the other thing is on the bottom here, consent must be continuously maintained. This is another thing that you'll hear throughout the program today, is that this is not a one and done. It's not set it and forget it. This is something that needs to be done regularly. We used to talk about quarterly, and a lot of companies that want to reduce their risk are actually doing monthly or even more frequent scans. So
Yeah.
it's more of a process.
Correct. Yeah, I want to add actually an anecdote here. Like, it reminds me of a customer of ours, wherein they were using Privado. They found an issue using Privado. I think it was somewhere around, let's say, January, if I remember correctly, of this year. And I think they kind of snoozed the issue to be remediated maybe for 60 days or something.
Mhm.
That they'll come back to it. I think within 2 weeks they got a SEPA claim with exactly that issue. So maybe on the regulatory side, things are still moving in a quarterly basis, but on the litigation side, I think they're tracking websites like, I don't know, maybe daily, more than even we are tracking for our customers. So it's, yeah, it's pretty different. I don't think we operated in this privacy environment for a while.
Yeah, and one last thing before we move on in terms of the regulatory environment, I've noticed that in more recent state privacy laws, back in the day, there used to be at least some of the laws used to have what's known as a cure period, which means if the regulator discovers an issue, then you have a certain grace period in order to fix things, and maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's 60 days. Increasingly, those cure periods are either maybe they're for the initial year or two of the law, and then they're sunsetted and they go away. So it's not like you have time to necessarily go and fix it. So that just increases the potential pain of needing to fix things that regulators are uncovering in terms of lack of compliance. Let's go ahead and move on right now to the next slide, please. And we've what we've done here is we've kind of identified a number of what we have seen, kind of aggregating the enforcement actions and seeing what are actually the problems that are rising to the surface over and over again that the regulators are uncovering and that companies are getting noticed for and served both on the regulatory side and on the private right of action side. And this first one I can't be overstated. I mean, Jimmy does this day in and day out. Firing, timing, and dark patterns. Can't tell you how many clients we have where it's just a cookie fired before consent was obtained. So it's just really a timing issue. And actually, Jimmy, let me kind of turn to you. When this happens, what typically is the cause of a cookie firing too early before consent is gained? What do you typically see as a way to fix that problem?
Yeah, sure, Dave. A lot of the times when it's that pre-consent or tag that it shouldn't be firing is firing um, before consent is given is usually due to a configuration issue on the back end, right? So a lot of the times clients will go ahead and put cookie banners onto their site and think they're done with the implementation. They'll take it, they'll be they put it on the site, they see it showing, they have a cookie notice now, and they think they're done. What we'll talk about in a little bit and go up what Dave's saying is some people will go in, check their actual dev tools and whatnot, and they'll still see some of these tags firing before they even give their consent. And that's usually due to the client not going in or the user not going in and actually configuring that cookie banner to block the appropriate tags when before the client gives consent. So a lot of the times this comes down to actually understanding the tool that you're using, not just taking a tool and throwing it onto your site and saying it's done, but that pre-configuration is a huge part of actually having a cookie banner, right? It's not just so simple of, all right, I'm going to take a tool like a CMP, throw it on my site, and everything's good to go. You got to make sure you understand the tool and configure it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on to this next column here, transparency and disclosure. It sounds straightforward, but it's amazing how easy it is to get this wrong. Again, kind of we differentiate in nomenclature between a notice and a privacy policy. A privacy policy we tend to think of as more an internal document that lays out the privacy promises the organization is going to make and how it's going to operate internally. Privacy notice is that outward-facing, public-facing notice on the website that says, here's what information we're going to collect, here's how we're going to collect it, here's what we're going to do with it, onward transfers, just kind of all the promises. And that information goes out of date very, very quickly. And it's quite a common problem to have that not be on a regular cadence to get updated. New tech stacks change, new vendor relationships, emerge constantly. So it's just very important to be managing that privacy notice. And as we're going to say later in the program, say what you do and then do what you say. And then the other thing on the bottom bullet here in this transparency and disclosure, make consent withdrawal and preference management simple and accessible. Regulators are looking as a consumer, they're approaching the site and saying, look, let's say I gave consent and I was okay with it at the time, and then I went back and I looked and I saw something or I made a change in my mind. Now I want to withdraw that consent. Is it easy to do that? Is it relatively straightforward? If it is and it's just a couple buttons, then great, then you're doing a terrific job. If I have to dig and go for pages, we've all had this experience, and it's really onerous, or you're making it creating a lot of friction between your customer and their ability to withdraw consent or change their consent. That can be a real problem. V, did you want to talk about this at all?
Yeah, I think less on less on that bit, but more around like as we get to the GPC, I've seen like a ton of issues popping out there. Yeah.
Yeah. So and actually, that's a good point. Let's move on to the GPC and consent and legitimate interest is something that we're going to touch on later and is pretty. It can be a bit of gray area, so we don't want to take too deep a dive into that. You can read the slides when you after the program. But on the GPC, the Global Privacy Control and Consumer Choice, again, there was a time when the global privacy control, which is a browser based control that a consumer can set that sends a signal to every website that you then visit that asks to kind of globally opt you out. Um, there was a good amount of time when this was a technical challenge to actually implement on the receiving side. And so I think there was a little bit of not a lot of action happening around GPC because it was kind of an understanding that, look, this is really difficult to operationalize from a technical standpoint. Those days are also over. Now, it's actually written into at least one California law that GPC in particular is laid out exactly for that particular technical control in the law, in the letter of the law, needs to be honored. Okay, so it's inherent and very important that organizations figure out how to do this technically, and this can be challenging across channels, devices, and tech stacks, and transmitting that signal downstream. So, V, yeah, you want to kind of shed a little bit more light on this for us?
Yeah, I think like GPC we've seen as the number one reason for privacy issues on websites,
Mm-hmm.
especially most of the CMP providers by design are acknowledging GPC signal. And the problem it ends up creating is in US especially, because we are in an opt-out regime, GPC makes your website in an opt-in format, right? Because let's say you have an opt-out, you expect the user will click reject and then you will process consent. What GPC changes is basically the moment the website is loaded, the signal is sent, you are pretty much saying no consent, right? So it's almost like you land on the website and you have opted out. The problem that we see on our clients is, and this takes a little bit of work to get it remediated, is on the banner immediately it will say your opt-out choices are honored, and you will see tons of pixels firing: TikTok, LinkedIn, Snap Pixel, Facebook, all of that. And the reason is kind of what even Jimmy had told. It's mostly because of misconfigurations. I've seen interesting misconfiguration. I've seen misconfiguration where they've enabled GPC, but they've disabled it for actually blocking the targeting cookies. I've seen issues wherein the banner loads after all these scripts. So the cookie banner is loading after all these pixels are loading, right? Which basically ends up creating other issues. That's another problem. There's always a race condition, like we call it's almost like a fire to load on the website. So your banner is loading, it gets the GPC signal. By the time it reacts to the GPC signal, TikTok is already firing. So these are practical issues. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not just like on the homepage, you might have a blog page which might be following a different format. So it's really about, again, like coming back to Dave, what you were saying is to operationalize this thing, what we need to do as privacy team is to have a central place where we have these controls defined like we have on this slide, and then we have a consistent way to audit it manually or with a technology like ours. And then to close the loop we need a remediation plan as well. So it's like a full program, and GPC is what we see is the number one problem there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Fee. All right, moving on and being conscious of time. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at an audit methodology, and so we're going to take you through the weeds. Like, what does this actually look like? How do you actually do an audit? And again, Jimmy, I know you do this day in and day out. Want to kind of take us through this workflow?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. So here over at Myna, we do this, like Dave just said, day in, day out. We go and do cookie consent audits on tons of clients' websites. And what you're seeing on your screen right now is kind of a typical route or mapping of how this cookie consent audit goes through. So number one and two kind of goes hand in hand together. If you look on the top left, you see the first item. It says website scanning and cookie inventory. So what this kind of entails is usually using an automated tool, such as like Privado or something like that, to go ahead and crawl a website and scan and see what trackers and tags are actually found on that website. Now, this doesn't just take trackers and tags, this takes network requests, and I think V will get into that a little bit later in the slides. You'll get a whole network log of what's coming in, what's going out. It would also tell you how many cookies are found on your page. This goes into the second point that you see at number two. It says tag and tracker discovery. Once you have a full scan and you understand how many cookies are on your site, you want to make sure that each tag and tracker is actually categorized correctly on a website. So a lot of the times clients will come to us and say, hey, we have 300 cookies on our site. However, we don't know how to properly classify some cookies, or some of our cookies might be misclassified. For example, Meta Pixel, LinkedIn pixels, TikTok pixels. Those are generally classified in the targeting category. However, some clients or some users, or during one of these scans, it might be categorized in the performance or function on accident. So that second point is actually understanding how each tag is categorized and what should be dropping on your page compared to what shouldn't be dropping on your page when users opt in or opt out of these categories, which is pretty huge. The third kind of section that we kind of cover is kind of what V was explaining in the first slide when we were talking, is the actual CMP configuration. When you actually go onto the website, how is this cookie banner working? If I click accept all, is it actually opting me into all of these cookies? If I click reject all, is it doing the vice versa? Is it actually rejecting me out of all these cookies? Another big thing that we test is regional compliance, right? If I have somewhere in Europe configured to be GDPR and to be opt in, I want to make sure that when I'm accessing the site from Europe, it's actually opting me out of all cookies by default, and I have to give explicit consent to
Mhm.
opt into all these categories. So that kind of goes into the CMP configuration thing, is the cookie banner actually functioning as it should to the user?
Hey, Jimmy, one quick note just to kind of in terms of tag classification for those that aren't aware, there can be gray areas in terms of how a cookie should be classified. So just want to state for the record here that it's important to consult legal on some of these. Some of them are pretty straightforward, whether they're operational or behavioral, but there can be some judgments made there. And whether you classify a cookie as one thing or another can make a big difference. So just important to have some kind of connection with your legal team so that you can get some of those kind of gray area decisions made.
Yep, no, it's a great call, Dave. We worked with several clients who have categorized different cookies, or the same cookie, I should say, as different categories. So, very
Mhm.
important to talk with your legal counsel and see how you actually are using that cookie on the site and how you want to classify it. Going up to our next thing that we were just kind of talking about is the GPC signal testing. And I just want to emphasize, like V said, this is pretty much the number one reason we're seeing a lot of these claims come in. This and the next thing I'll be talking about. But GPC signal testing is a huge thing that we do now. Usually, a lot of these users that use GPCs now are really heavily data privacy people. Other people don't really even know that GPCs exist. So, a lot of these people that utilize GPC, usually that's one of the first things they go on. They go on the site, they see if their GPC signal is being acknowledged. If it's not, it's an instant red flag for them, and they're going to dig even deeper and deeper to try to find some other things to put a claim in for. So that
Mhm.
GPC signal testing is pretty huge. Having that signal when you go onto the site that says, "Hey, your GPC signal has been honored," showing and being transparent to the user, saying that you're actually acknowledging that GPC signal is huge. Another thing I want to emphasize that V kind of emphasized is actually making sure that GPC is configured for the proper non-essential cookie categories, right? So a lot of times we'll work for a client and they'll only have GPC enabled for targeting cookies, for example. Whereas a lot of the things that we've seen is every single cookie category you give the user the opportunity to opt out of, you should just allow that GPC signal to turn that off as well. If it's considered a non-essential cookie, usually the user doesn't want it on their device if they're using a GPC. So a lot of times when we're working with CMPs, we recommend users to have it toggled on for all cookie categories that are non-essential. Moving on to our next part is this pre-consent tag firing analysis, and I kind of spoke on this a little bit before, but this is basically making sure that your proper cookies are dropping based on a user's consent. So what I mean by that, to clarify a little bit, is if I'm in Europe and I'm in an opt-in region, I expect only my essential cookies to be loading onto the page on my first page visit. If I go onto the site and I open up my dev tools and I'm seeing Google Analytic cookies drop, I'm seeing Facebook cookies drop, obviously something's not working with my cookie banner, right? Because I'm in an opt-in region and I'm seeing all these tracking technologies still load on my page.
Right.
So as I was saying, the GPC signal testing, and this is our number one red flags when we go and audit a website, right? We test the GPC and then we see what cookies are firing when we're opted out of all non-essential cookie categories. If we see several cookies firing, a little bit of a red flag, we then help the client remediate these by configuring their CMPs or fixing them with regional configurations and geolocation rules and whatnot. The final thing before we get into the kind of overall end of the audit is the privacy notice validation. So a lot of the times when we go on cookie banners, we don't see a link to a privacy notice, which we highly recommend because your privacy notice is kind of bread and butter when it comes to what you're actually putting on your site, right? That's your whole privacy. To notice you're being transparent to your users. The privacy notice should have a full detailed list of a cookie breakdown, how you take in cookies, what cookies you're using, and as I was saying, there should be a link on the banner. This also kind of comes into the transparency aspect as well. So on your banner, you should be being transparent to a lot of your users instead of just having one overall bundle of a cookie group like essential cookies and non-essential cookies, right? You should break them down into necessary, functional, performance, analytics. You want to make sure that you're being fully transparent with what type of cookies you have on your site and what information you're collecting from each user. That pretty much wraps up the actual audit. From there, we then put into a nice documentation, a nice Excel sheet and Word, PowerPoints, and whatnot. We do an analysis and finding. We do a compliance score. We then send that out to our client, whoever we're working with. They take a look at it. They say, okay, we are only 78% compliant. We can increase in the CMP configuration review. We can increase in some of the pre-consent tag firing, and we can also enable GPC in X, Y, and Z. We then work with them to remediate, and that's pretty much the whole cookie audit process that we do over here at Myna.
That's terrific, Jimmy. Thank you so much for making that so, laying that out so clearly and so simply. And I want to back up to step 4 just quickly. Again, back to GPC to kind of underscore something you said, Jimmy, that can be a forgotten step, which is that even if when you're honoring that GPC signal, it's essential that you actually notify the user that you've honored it. So you need to display. And this is actually written into some of these laws again as something that needs to be taken care of. So you need to provide the notice to that. To the user that you actually have honored the signal. So terrific. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. Otherwise, again, looking at time, I want to continue to move on. If we could jump to the next slide, please.
Yeah, someone had a question regarding what technology you can track, and I think V will cover a little bit, but they just mentioned if it's in app too. And yes, these tools do have scanners to actually track what SDKs are firing in mobile applications and whatnot.
Yeah, Lael, that's probably a good time. I don't know, V, I know you were going to touch on this because we're talking primarily about desktop website cookie compliance, but of course this applies on mobile as well and SDKs. So we'll get into that in a minute. But maybe we can move to the next slide for now and cover the part 1 of audit methodology. And I think V, you're going to cover this for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks Jimmy for covering all that up. It was a pretty dense slide there, as I mean, I'm sure everyone realized, and I truly appreciate like all the steps you lay down, because there are a lot of things you need to do to get to that compliance. And kind of where we come in as well is to simplify some of the steps. I think like towards the end, as you're talking about the entire governance process, I think that's critical. So I always, whenever we're speaking to customers, it's always the conversation. There's the technology, but there's a lot of process, because it's not just enough to find issues. You need to be able to remediate them in time, and then also report up like which team needs more training. Which is it, the marketing team, is it the web team, if you have brand, which brand, right? So
Yeah.
all those conversations, I know we kind of covered pretty quickly, but yeah, they were all there, so thanks for that. Now just coming into like, and I'll tie up some of the comments as well, like where Privado comes in from a scanning technology perspective. So as you can see on the screen, there are pretty much 3 steps or for our audit, right? Number one is what you see, the screenshot of a dummy website that we have. Essentially, whenever Privado runs a scan, we start multiple user journeys. You can map these user journeys to key consent actions. So global privacy control is one, interacting with the banner is one. So let's take this example. In this, the the highlighted part talks about rejecting a cookie banner. It could be a global privacy control as well. In all of these user actions, all we're trying to do is we take what we call a pre-audit consent action. So either global privacy control, rejecting the banner. The moment we take that, we start monitoring what you see in the middle image, which is these network calls, cookies. This allows us to figure out what all tracking technologies are firing on your website. It could be, like any type of technology, could be a script, could be a cookie sync call in ad tech environments, could be a direct API call. There are multiple, could be a tag, could be tag piggybacking. There are multiple ways in which these third party tracking technologies are added on your website. And I would say, since uh, ad blocking has come up, it has become even more varied. Earlier in the web scanning side of house, it was pretty simple. You add a pixel, the pixel would work. Now you have conversion API, server side tracking, you have domain clock. There's so many ways that marketing teams are trying to put in so their technology doesn't get ad blocked. So there are multiple ways. So that's the step two. Once we have that, all we're doing is we're looking at what all fired on your website from a third party perspective, script perspective, and cookies perspective. And then we apply policies and controls. These policies and controls are simple, are kind of like, if you map it back to a few slides that Dave had presented, for dark patterns, for GPC, opt in, opt out. If you're checking from Europe, we're checking no non essential cookies should have dropped, no advertising third party should have fired, because both of them require consent. If you're tracking from US, let's say California, then we want to make sure our sell or share categorization is working well, which means we don't have the Facebook pixel or TikTok pixel firing on your website. We don't have any advertising cookies being stored. And if any of these controls get violated, these get converted into trackable tasks or risks or issues. Those are then presented with a remediation step, and then forwarded. So that's a typical audit process. From a real life scenario perspective, again, as I said, like, a website, when we run the scan first, could have 30% compliance, 50% compliance. It fails on multiple things. The most common place it fails is the GPC signal testing. That's number one. The other place where it fails is when you start with accepting, like, you don't have a banner. The way the user can opt out is via the do not sell or share button from the footer. Those kind of user journeys is where we see a lot of issues.
Mhm.
uh, and then it's all about taking those issues and getting those remediated. um, Beyond just looking at the consent, you also want to look at, again, privacy notice validation. Do we have all the right links? Right, you can do a one-off audit, but if you have, let's say, 10 websites and you want to audit all them on a weekly, monthly basis, you can set those up as well. So if you go to the next slide, I would love to cover that. Yeah, from a live audit finding perspective, these are some of the common issues, kind of, I was trying to cover them, that we see. The number one being marketing or advertising cookies firing before consent. uh, it's interesting why this happens. There are multiple reasons, so let me point a couple of examples. I think the common ones we already covered, right? Like, you have the CMP misconfigured, you have these scripts firing before the CMP, there is this opt-in versus opt-out issues. There are other issues as well. So if you use a technology like Google Tag Manager, it might look like that your CMP is sending the consent signals to Google Tag Manager, but there is an extra configuration you need to do in Google Tag Manager for it to be honored, right? And that is skipped, which means you will be thinking you're telling GTM no, opt out, but the Google Tag Manager or TLM or whatever is not configured, so all those pixels will be going through. A very common issue. Another really common one I've seen is YouTube videos. That's like the another big piece I've seen in corporate websites. So not like a storefront, but let's say, about.privado.ai, right? And we have, a nice video about Privado. We put the YouTube link directly. The moment you
Mhm.
put that, YouTube load all the um, advertising calls. So, and then that basically is not addressed. The team doesn't know, and that creates issues. So all the embeds, that's another common one I've seen on marketing. You might add a Twitter embed, you might add a Facebook embed. You're trying to show comments. All these technologies do offer a privacy safe way to deploy. Like, YouTube has YouTube no cookies. You can make it like on request, load it only after a user clicks on it. So there are multiple ways, but that's another common example I've seen. So, long story short, what I'm trying to say is there are so many things which could go wrong on your website. And from a regulatory or a litigatory perspective, they only need to find one thing, right? So it's like, in security, they classically say, like, you might be patching 100 weaknesses on your system. The hacker only needs one weakness to get in, and then they're in. So it's the same with websites, right? Like, if your website is being audited by a regulator or a litigator, all they need is one weakness, all they need is one issue, and there are, like, as of now, there's like multiple issues. We've run these reports a lot of times. So I think that's more from a audit issue perspective. I think from our perspective, that's priority one. Whenever we run an audit, even working with Myna folks, is mostly about how can we get the critical issues resolved, so we have a much better compliance posture. Uh, Beyond that, there are other issues, as we talked about. Data sharing is a big one that we've started to see even in SEPA cases come up again and again. So I think that's a big piece, which is step two from my perspective. Is if your basic pixels are working, then getting your forms automatically filled in and seeing like, hey, if health data or financial data is leaking to any of these pixels. And finally, the last part, which ends up frustrating the privacy teams a little bit more, is tag piggybacking. So I found this very interesting, a lot more on publishers versus non-publishers, but even in non-publishers sometimes, wherein you don't even have relationships with certain third parties that fire on your website. Classic example, if you add, I think Trade Desk is a common one I've seen. If you add a Trade Desk pixel, advertiser, they can bring their own third parties which you have no relationship with, and that opens up a bunch of risks, because who do you talk to? There's no business owner, there's no contract. So that creates a
Yeah,
bunch of issues as well.
Yeah.
this is a huge issue that we see with a lot of our clients is when we point this out. Usually, this comes from a lot of iframes too. When you embed iframes, like if you embed like a coverage map somewhere or like a weather widget somewhere, you'll see random cookies coming from their service, which you have no control over. We'll point this out to our clients and they'll say, well, how do we remediate this? And that's when you have to go, what V was just talking about, who do I have to talk to make sure that these scripts
Mhm.
aren't being put on my page? Why are they being put on my page? So that's why V said it could be a little bit more frustrating when you have to deal with these, because it's quite literally tags that you don't have any control over. You're just utilizing a service that is then putting tags onto your page without basically your permission. So
Yeah. Uh, well, thanks, you guys. Before in a minute, we're going to move on to looking at some actual enforcement actions and kind of what came out of them. What were the violations, et cetera. But before we do, V, this might be a good time to back to Lael's question earlier to just talk briefly about the mobile side of things, because increasingly we're seeing these need to honor these things on the mobile side, and it's complicated and it's evolving. But can you just give us kind of a summary snapshot of what's happening on the mobile side in terms of these compliance issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think mobile, in my opinion, it has two sides to it. One is obligations is the same, right? So I think that doesn't change. I think auditability becomes difficult for privacy teams. And like an expert like you, Myna, you guys can run like an audit, you can still see that. But a website, for example, even anyone in the privacy team can open a dev tool portal and at least see something, or they can install an extension like Ghostry or like some extension to see what's firing. Mobile app, the trickiest part is there is no easy way for you to audit. You can't actually look at it. Now, in one way, that could be said like, hey, it's also great because not a consumer can't audit it. But what we've observed is in all these, again, from a regulator perspective, from these litigators, they have technologies to actually scan and do that. So that puts the privacy teams under this little bit of trouble that they can't audit their web mobile apps, but the litigators and regulators can, and that's where having a scanner becomes much more important. And in website, it's more about scripts. In mobile and cookies, in mobile app, it's primarily around SDKs. And if you initialize the SDKs right, again, you can have SDK piggybacking, similar to scripts tags piggybacking. Is similar concept. I would just say it's just a little bit harder. So our clients who use our mobile app scanning technology, they do the same. They run a scan to get all their SDKs, classify them. Then they run again user journey. So we do. There's no equivalent of global privacy control, but you have in Apple the ATT banner, you have the cookie banner, the SDK banners, which either via settings or through a proper banner. And again, you're trying to do the same thing. Once someone rejects, you want to see which SDK fired, which third party fired, and if it's advertising and you have opted out, that's wrong. Data sharing is actually even more complicated in mobile apps. You do want to monitor that. So I think similar concept. In my point of view, the risk is higher because you don't really know anything about mobile app,
Yeah.
and lately we have seen the regulators and litigators know much more than the privacy teams.
yeah, I think one main issue with the mobile apps is that a lot of users rely on the actual device or uh, the mobile phone that they're using, for example, like iPhones and whatnot, to rely on their privacy settings. For example, like in your actual iPhone's privacy settings, when you go onto an app for the first time, you'll get that notification that says do not allow app to track or sell or share. A lot of these users and services might rely on that when users say deny to then not fire any of their tracking technologies. Whereas that only goes so far to communicate with only certain services that the phone that you're using allows it to communicate with. There might be other services that you're still firing on your device that goes through those privacy settings, which these realtors and whatnot, not realtors, regulators, sorry, um,
Mhm.
can come back and say, hey, we're still seeing this fire, this fire, and this fire. So uh, that goes into the kind of the configuration part of don't just rely on seeing something, clicking deny, and expecting it to work. Actually audit, make sure it's doing the proper thing that it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, that's so. There's a Jimmy. If I understand what you're saying, there's a misinterpretation on the user that settings that they're doing on their phone are going to get translated through to certain sites, but they're actually not. There's a kind of gap there.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Yep.
Yeah,
And then going
yeah.
off where Ron was just saying, how do regulators usually perform a review as an outsider? They usually use tools like he was saying that scan the application. It picks up what SDKs are actually being fired. So you might have Facebook SDKs, you might have a different type of Google SDKs and whatnot. They then interact or simulate a user going on and clicking the reject all when they come on through a cookie banner or through that mobile applications platform, the privacy settings. They'll then see and repeat the test again and see which SDKs are still firing after the user denies their consent. And that's
Mhm.
usually how they get an audit of applications.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that, Jimmy. I was going to say the same thing. So wrong. Yeah, the regulators are able to kind of simulate a user through a mobile phone and then just see if that user journey honors their choices and their preferences or not. So all right, terrific. Well, I know we're at 11:41 here, so moving on to the next slide, we just wanted to share with you kind of a real world snapshot of some of the latest and kind of most relevant um, uh, uh, enforcement actions that have taken place. So as you can see here, we've got GM, Disney, Play on Sports, and Ford here. All some recent enforcement actions, relatively large fines. I think there's a trend. Fair to say there's a trend in terms of fines being increasingly more significant. There was a long time where fines seemed so low that it was just a slap on the wrist and didn't seem to have much effect. But I think some of these have a little bit more heft to them. And as you look at them, and also just notice, one of the in terms of industries, if you are a heavy B2C company, that's going to increase your exposure and increase your risk. You've got a lot of those one-to-one customer relation channels going on. It's going to increase your risk exposure. So, but looking at the list here in terms of the violations of what actually happened, it's all the things that we've been talking about. Again, you need to make sure that your GPC is being honored. Onward selling and sharing of information, we touched on it briefly earlier in the program, but do not sell, do not share needs to be a separate option, needs to be very prominent, needs to be very obvious that the customer can make their choices known there through those controls. Um, and interestingly, I think with the car companies, with GM and Ford, and I was thinking about this earlier during our discussion, when you get into user interfaces beyond the desktop computer and the mobile app, it gets increasingly challenging to provide user options, right? So you're in a car, it's going to be that much more challenging to make those user options available and to have the technology working in the back end to be able to have those signals conveyed through systems and across channels back to the website, et cetera, where a user might also interact. So I don't know, V, anything kind of jump out at you here in terms of any of these particular things the regulators have picked out in terms of violations?
Um, I think quite a lot you already covered, and I'm sure some of the things will come in Q&A as well. But I think again, like from my perspective, it all points to that. From a privacy team's perspective, it's just looking at website and also mobile app from a governance perspective and building a program around it. Because as you can see, the things that companies are getting fined are pretty varied, and each fine might have multiple things. So it's not one thing that you do and you become compliant. Like if the
Right.
regulators are treating it like a constant program where they have a audit team, they have technologists, and they're auditing regularly, we need to do similar stuff on our side where we define the controls, we do constant auditing, we have a remediation process, we have a risk reporting process. And it's more about like looking at the entire website and mobile app as something where we want to build a digital, almost like a digital governance program around,
Mhm.
versus looking at it as a one-off, this control versus that. I think that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, and V, one of the things I was just thinking about is when we're brought in to do a privacy program assessment, kind of an overall what we call a health check, and just check. One of the first things we check is what are the obvious public facing aspects of your business. You know, your main website or the home page on your mobile app, and let's make sure that it's relatively easy to find the privacy notice, to get in there, that it was recently updated, that the and then we look into, do the things that you promised in your notice match your actual operations behind the scene. So same, the
Which is
regulators
the
find.
FTC fine, right? Like, which is like we didn't even discuss the FTC
Yeah,
part, but that's basically the Hims and her FTC. Not, I'm not fine really, but the entire Hims and her FTC discussion is all about, and even before that, especially around health data that becomes really important, or sensitive data per se, is what you have in your notice basically becomes like, that's another like promise, and it's more consumer deception practices that becomes another
exactly.
angle, less privacy law. Yeah.
Exactly. And to your point, Fee, when you were talking about, trends here amongst the different things that regulators are looking for, if and I've spoken with regulators at conferences, it's like, we go in and we check, and if there's something that pops out at us, then we're going to start investigating further, right? So take care of all of the most obvious things, and then go the next layer deep, and then the next layer deep is a great way to
Agreed.
approach it, in order, in the kind of priorities in terms of reducing your risks. So let's go ahead and move on in these final minutes here. Keep the questions coming. Really appreciate the interaction in the comments section. We only have a few minutes left in the program, so if you do have questions, please put them in the comments, and we'll try to address as many as we can. We put this together for you, to kind of give you a kind of a high level, simple roadmap of what an effective consent program looks like. What are the steps you need to take, to work toward compliance in your communication, digital communication with your customers? So obviously, the first one, run a fresh website scan. We've talked about this. Just get one of these tools. Privado was an amazing tool. We use it all the time, and it really uncovers the areas that you need to address, and provides a nice roadmap for gap analysis for you. Verify all pre-consent behavior. In other words, we talked about timing, being a real issue that pops up again and again and again, in terms of things that need to get fixed, that are potentially going to be in violation. Test GPC recognition. I don't think we need to talk about that anymore. Review cookie categorizations. Jimmy mentioned that earlier. Easy to do. And as I mentioned, please work with counsel on that, because there are some places where it can get a little tricky in terms of your cookie categorizations. Align privacy notices with actual tracker inventory. Again, make sure that what you're stating outwardly, publicly to your customers, are what you're actually doing operationally on the back end. And then establish quarterly, even monthly audits. Again, it's not a set it and forget it. This is something that needs to happen again and again and again. So moving on to the next slide here.
Dave, could I chime in one more thing that I think can
Yeah,
possibly
absolutely,
do, which
Jimmy.
I think is actually really important, and one thing that we really recommend our clients to do, and a lot of our clients don't actually implement themselves, is to develop some type of standards and procedures on implementing new checking technologies on your site, right? So this goes back into what V was saying before, of when you can have a compliance site. When you do a first Privado scan, you go through, your site's perfectly compliant, everything looks perfect, but then 60 days from now, they can run another scan and something can be going off and something gets flagged. This usually comes through from not having a good change management, or allowing anyone to put anything on your website basically whenever they want, right? Having a good kind of overall methodology of, these trackers are getting implemented at this date, we're approving these trackers to get implemented, and we're ensuring that these are going to be cookie compliant or set up for
Mhm.
compliance, is extremely crucial to keeping your site compliant once you get it compliant in the first place, right? This goes
Agreed.
back to what Dave was saying. It's not just a one and done thing. It's not just get it compliant and it's going to be compliant forever. This is a continuous process that you have to develop, like, methodologies, procedures, and standards about. So that's one thing I would highly recommend for a lot of users if they're trying to implement something.
Couldn't
Yeah,
agree
and
more, Jimmy. Yeah, go ahead, V. Yeah.
no, I was just saying, like, in some of our customers who have gone through this journey, exactly they followed what Jimmy said. And of course, because we work closely together, is once they get their website compliant, now they have this gate in either a couple of places, new website launches, especially if they are a brand where they're doing a lot of microsites or marketing websites, they have to go through the Privado check. If they get passed, then they can go live. And second is for new updates to the website, they also do something called QA scanning or sandbox scanning. So whenever a website change has to happen, it lands in a pre-production testing environment. So they run a test scan, and if it passes, then they can make it live. So I think that maturity definitely is step two, step three, but it's important to like reach there. So I mean, if yours is ad hoc, yeah, of course, goal one is to get the first scans done. But I also wanted to talk about, like, we've seen success with clients where they have taken this compliance from ad hoc to getting the first compliance done, and then getting to continuous scanning and really maturing their programs.
And lastly, to this point, look, if you have a good marketing department, they're active, they're doing things, they're trying new tools, they've got new campaigns, they're actually doing things, and it's gonna change. New tech stacks, new systems coming on board. So it should be a dynamic environment. And it is kind of a regular thing. And to that point, I was just thinking, from a governance perspective, on the back end, develop if you're charged with compliance and you're in the privacy the privacy department, make sure you establish good relationships with the marketing department in particular, and have them notify you, hey, we've got this new campaign that's going to go out and we may have some issues there. Just wanted to give you guys a heads up. If you have that relationship where you can get them to be proactive, it's going to make your job a lot easier. So work on those relationships and make sure that you have the kind of constant communication channels going there. So, all right, we're just about done here. I think we have one more slide. We've just got a few key takeaways we kind of want to leave you with. Um, this first one, we mentioned at the very outset of the program, there was a time when if you just looked good on your site, that was enough. That's no longer the case, as we've been saying throughout the entire program. It has to be operationally effective. What you say, what you promise needs to be affected. And that your actual behavior determines risk, because now regulators are using these tools, they're uncovering these things, and or in private right of action, they're looking for the vulnerability, looking for the weakness. They find one, they start looking for others. They have a couple more. Now they've got a few. Now there's a problem. And so I don't think we need to say any more about the GPC testing. It's just increasingly put that at the top of your list. You heard it from us here that it's a major issue frequently, and that again, regular cadences, set them, do those scans, do those audits, just set up a schedule, just do them on a regular basis, and you're going to be that much more likely to find your gaps and then be able to remediate your gaps. And that's about it. I don't know, Jimmy and V, do you guys have any kind of closing thoughts or any kind of key takeaways you want to add to the list here for folks?
Not for me. I think we did cover a bunch of things, but yeah, I mean, we have time, so I would invite as many questions as you all want. Please use the opportunity for that.
Mm-hmm. Agree with V.
So we have a question come in from Wrong here.
I can take that up,
Okay,
Dave.
terrific.
Awesome. So I think Ron has a question in terms of how much collaboration is needed from the app owner. So this could be the app developer for a scan to be performed for app compliance. Is the image file, which is APK for Android and IPA for iOS, needed? So not really wrong. We can do the scan from Play Store URL and App Store URL. In case of website, all you need is like Privado.ai. In case of mobile app, we just need playstore.com/privado.ai. So we can and the same is true for regulators, by the way. So they don't need your APK and IPA file. They can run the test just from the publicly listed Play Store or App Store URLs. But yeah, thanks for asking that question. Again, please feel free to add more questions. We'll be happy to take those.
All right. And as mentioned earlier, if you register for the program, we will send access to the recording if you want to go back and review anything, and a PDF of the slides. So you can keep those as a resource. Um, all right. Looks like we're slowing down there. Well, with that, thanks everybody very much for making some time to join us. We really appreciate it. It was great having the conversation with you, V and Jimmy. Thanks for taking time out of your busy days. Great being able to share all this information with everybody. And thanks to Shanae in the background here for helping us run the webinar. And hopefully you saw the links where you can get in touch with V over at Privado or with Jimmy and I over at Myna Partners. And we really appreciate you spending some time with us. Hope you found it interesting and useful. And with that, I'll go ahead and take us to a program close. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Thanks, all.
Thanks,
Thank
Dave.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, V.